The harvest ball at Aldermere Hall was the loudest sound Julian Ellesmere had permitted in 6 months, and he hated every note of it. Fiddles sawed through the long gallery. Tenant farmers stamped the reel in their scrubbed Sunday boots, and the great sheaves of barley lashed to the pillars shed a fine gold dust that drifted down into the wine like pollen. On the mantelpiece, where a clock had once ticked, someone had set the corn dolly, a small woman plaited from the last cut sheaf of the year, kept by old custom so the harvest's life would not die in the winter with the fields. Julian did not look at it. He had trained himself, this last half year, not to look at small woven things. He stood in the doorway with a glass he had no intention of drinking, and endured the county's kindness, which was harder to bear than its cruelty had ever been. His cousin Lavinia moved through the crowd in his place, gracious and tireless, touching an elbow here, bending to a deaf dowager there, doing the 100 small labors a duchess does without being seen to do them. "Your cousin is a marvel," a squire's wife murmured close to his ear. "Whatever would you manage without her, poor man?" He had buried his wife in the spring. It was October now, and he still could not answer such a question without something closing over his throat like cold water. Then the fiddles faltered. Not stopped, faltered, the way a heart trips once before it understands why. A draft came down the gallery from the far end, and every candle flame in the room leaned the same way at once toward the great doors, which had swung open on the black October night. A woman stood in them. She wore a gown of harvest gold silk sewn all over with sheaves of wheat, a gown the whole of Lincolnshire had admired at 3 seasons of balls and would have known blindfold. The late Duchess of Ellesmere's gown, the one they said had gone into the ground with her. The reel came apart bar by bar and died. 100 faces turned, and 100 throats forgot how to draw breath. Julian's glass slid from his fingers, and it did not shatter. It only rolled a foot across the boards and bled a slow, dark tongue of wine into the seams. The woman raised her chin into the light of 1,000 candles, and every soul in that gallery saw her face at the same instant and knew it. Someone screamed the name from the back of the room. Rosamund, the syllables ragged, as if torn. Lavinia turned toward the doors, and Julian watched the color drain out of his cousin's face as though a cord behind it had been cut. But the woman in gold did not scream, or weep, or rush across the floor, or sway toward a faint. She only looked at the man who had knelt in the rain over her grave. And she said, in a voice worn thin as a coin, but perfectly, dreadfully clear, "Good evening, husband. I have come home for what is mine." 3 years before that door opened, the marriage that made it possible was arranged the way most great marriages were. For money on the one side and for blood on the other, with love mentioned by no one at the table. The dukedom of Ellesmere was very old and very poor. Its acres were entailed, its roofs let in the rain. And Julian had come into a title that impressed the whole county, and a mortgage that kept his steward awake at night. Rosamund Vane brought the cure in the plainest form, £30,000 her grandfather had won out of drained fen and Lincolnshire wool, sitting quiet and solid in the government funds. She was an heiress. Julian was a duke who could not pay his own gardeners without borrowing. The bargain wrote itself in an afternoon. But her mother had been a clear-eyed woman, and dying, had done the one thing English law permitted a mother to do for a daughter. Under the old rule of coverture, a wife owned nothing. The day she married, her fortune passed whole into her husband's hands, to spend or to lose or to gamble into the German sea, and she had no more claim on it than the horses had. So Lady Vane, before the wedding, had wrapped Rosamund's money in a marriage settlement. £30,000 locked in trust for her daughter's sole and separate use, watched over by 2 trustees, and fenced about with a clause the lawyers called a restraint upon anticipation, which meant, in plain speech, that no husband, no creditor, no honeyed word on earth could ever coax Rosamund into signing the money away. Mr. Thorne, the family's gray and careful solicitor, had drawn it and held the original deed, and had told Rosamund on her wedding morning in the driest voice imaginable, "This paper is the only wall a woman is allowed to build, my lady. Mind you keep it standing." She came to Aldermere expecting, if not love, then at least a place in a man's attention. She found the place. The man was never in it. At the long dinner table they sat a wilderness of white damask apart, and Julian was courteous to her the way a bolted door is courteous. "The low fields flooded again," she would say, and he would answer, "I have written to Thorne," and the silver would scrape, and the candles would gutter, and neither of them would say the thing behind the thing. He had been 9 years old when his own mother ran off with an Italian music master, and 11 when his father turned wholly to granite. And he had drawn from that the single hard lesson that to want a woman was to hand her the knife to cut you. So he kept his wife the length of the table and the far side of the corridor away, and called it dignity, and did not notice, for 2 whole years he did not notice, that she had begun to be the reason he came home. She did not weep at him. That was never her way. She learned the estate instead, the tenants' children's names, the trick of the drainage in the low fields, the accounts he could not stand to read. She was patient with the maids and immovable with the factor. And the county came, slowly, to respect the quiet Duchess who never raised her voice and never once lost an argument. Only Bet Marsh, the old nurse she had brought up from the fens, ever saw her cry, and Bet saw it seldom. Into that cold, well-run house came Lavinia Croft, Julian's cousin on the mother's side, poor, clever, and past 30. She had been passed from richer relation to richer relation her whole life, useful and unwed. The woman who arranges the flowers and is thanked and then forgotten by supper. She ran Aldermere beautifully. She made Julian laugh, which Rosamund in 3 years had never once managed. And one evening in the second winter, coming late and soft-footed to the study for a book, Rosamund found her cousin at the great desk with a candle drawn close and the settlement papers open flat beneath her hand. Lavinia's finger rested on a single line, the line about the £30,000, and her lips moved, reading it over. She looked up unhurried and smiled her warm, tireless smile. "Such tedious stuff, cousin. I only wanted the estate map beneath. Shall I ring for your chocolate?" Rosamund said it was no matter, and let it pass. She was a long time forgetting the look on Lavinia's face before the smile came down over it, a look she would see again, much later, bending over her on a cold table in a cold room. It began so gently that afterward no one could name the week. First, a heaviness in the limbs, then a swimming behind the eyes. Rosamund would rise from her chair, and the room would tilt like a boat, and she would sit again and laugh at her own foolishness. Winter thawed into a wet Lincolnshire spring, blackthorn foaming white along the hedges, lambs staggering in the low fields. And while the whole country came back to life, the Duchess grew thinner inside her gowns, week upon week, like a candle burning down inside its own lantern. Each night Lavinia brought the tonic up herself. She would set the taper on the night table and pour the dark, sweetish stuff into the glass with her own hand. "For your nerves, dearest," she would say, smoothing the coverlet, unhurried, kind. "Mr. Pike mixed it particular for your case. Drink it while it's fresh." It smelled faintly of poppies, and it tasted of sugar over something bitter. And it laid Rosamund down into a sleep so deep and so heavy that she woke each morning feeling as if she had been dragged up, drowned from the bottom of a pond. She did not know then what she came bitterly to know later, that the sweetness was laudanum, the tincture of opium sold across every apothecary's counter in England, a medicine in a single spoon and a killing in a cupful, and that the measure in her nightly glass had been rising, patiently, week on week, like brown water climbing a fen dike in the rains. Her hands took a tremor she could not still. Her heart would race and then miss its footing and stumble. Mr. Pike, the apothecary, came out from Louth and frowned and spoke gravely of a decline and bled her from the arm, which helped nothing at all and left her grayer than before. And Julian was in London the whole of that spring, wrestling the mortgage into some shape the bank would suffer. And he wrote to her twice about money, and she answered once about the low fields, and neither of them wrote the thing they meant. On the morning he left, he had stopped in her doorway with his gloves half on, as though there were a sentence caught behind his teeth. And she had waited, holding her breath against the pillow, and he had only bowed and gone down to the carriage. She lay and listened to the wheels grind away over the wet gravel until she could hear them no more. And then she turned her face to the wall. That shut door she would carry a great distance, further than either of them could have dreamed. There came a night near the end of April when the tremor in her hands would not stop, and a cold clarity moved through her that was steadier than any fever. She lay very still and thought it through to the end. She was not declining. She was being emptied, a little each night, by a patient hand that smoothed her coverlet and wished her sweet dreams. She had no proof and no strength to run, and no one within reach she dared to trust but the old woman asleep by the fire. So she did the only thing a frightened, clever woman could do. When Bet had gone out to fetch water, Rosamund crept to the press and took down the one paper in the world that mattered. The original settlement, her mother's wall, the true deed that no forgery could stand against so long as it drew breath. And by the light of a shielded candle, with fingers that shook so hard she pricked herself twice, she stitched it flat into the deep hem of her harvest gown, the gold one sewn with wheat, and hung the gown at the very back of the press behind the winter cloaks, where no searching hand would think to feel. They cut the wheat, her mother used to say, plaiting the last sheaf by the fire into its little straw woman. But they keep the last sheaf. Nothing that is truly loved is ever wholly gone. Rosamund whispered it into the dark, over and over, until the poppy came up and dragged her under. In the gray hour before dawn, her maid found the Duchess of Ellsmere cold in her bed, her lips the blue of skimmed milk, her breast still. And Mr. Pike, roused from Louth and yellow-eyed in the candlelight, laid 2 fingers to her throat and held a polished glass to her mouth, and shook his head, and said that she was dead. They buried the Duchess of Ellsmere with unseemly haste, and every soul in the county agreed afterward that it could not have been helped. Over the deathbed, Mr. Pike had let fall the word putrid, a fever gone bad, a taint in the blood, and in a country that still remembered the black years of sickness. The mere whisper of contagion emptied a great house faster than fire. A body thought to carry a putrid fever went into the earth within days, coffined and sealed, and no fine clothes went down with it. The good gowns were kept for the living, and the dead went to God in a plain, winding sheet. So Rosamund's harvest gown stayed at the back of the press, with its secret sewn inside the hem. And Rosamund herself was measured for elm and laid out in the cold north parlor, while the whole of Aldermere hung itself in black. Julian came too late. He rode up from London through 2 nights on a horse he very nearly killed. And he came home to a house with its mirrors draped in crape and its clocks all stopped at the hour of her death. The shutters barred against the spring, the servants moving in the flat black of their mourning like figures cut from paper. He went to the north parlor where she lay, and he stood over her a long time in his traveling dirt. And the thing that broke open in him was not grief alone, but the particular horror of a man who understands, 1 hour too late, the size of what he never once troubled to look at. He had married her for £30,000 and a mended roof. He had never told her that somewhere in the 2nd year the sound of her step in the gallery had become the thing he came home for. Now the step was silenced, and the words had nowhere left in the world to go. And the Duke of Ellesmere knelt down by an elm coffin and wept in a way his granite father had spent a lifetime forbidding. Lavinia wept too, and her tears were the riddle no one at Aldermere ever thought to solve. She stood at the graveside in the blackthorn-scented rain, veiled to the chin in crape, and her sorrow looked as true as the Duke's. Perhaps a portion of it was. You cannot pass 3 years as the useful, unthanked, unwed woman in another family's house without learning to hate very quietly the one who owns it all and does not even seem to want it. And Rosamund had not wanted it. Not Julian, not the great cold rooms, not the money her mother had walled away. Lavinia would have gone down on her knees in gratitude for 1/10 of it. That, she told herself under the veil, was the whole injustice of the world in one grave. And she had merely set it right. They lowered the coffin into the churchyard at the shoulder of the wolds, and the parson read the words, and the wet earth went down onto the lid with a sound that has no other sound like it. Julian did not stir for an hour after the last mourner had gone, until the sexton stood off among the yews, leaning on his spade, waiting. At length Lavinia came back through the rain and drew the Duke away by the arm, gentle, steadying, indispensable. And the county watched from under its dripping umbrellas and thought what a comfort the cousin was to him, and how natural it would be, in a year or 2, when the black was folded away and put by. But there is one thing more to tell of that burial, and it happened the night before, in the cold north parlor, where old Bet Marsh sat the death watch alone. Custom set a watcher by the dead through the dark hours, and Bet had nursed Rosamund from a red, squalling infant and would suffer no other hands near her now. A little after 2, bending to smooth the sheet across her lady's breast, Bet saw the polished penny laid upon the left eyelid tremble. And a breath, one shallow, impossible breath, misted the cold face of the coin. Bet Marsh did not scream. 70 years in the fens had taught her that a scream only fetches the wrong people at speed. She laid her cracked brown hand flat on her lady's breast and felt it, under the killing chill of the skin, the faintest flutter, a wren's heart buried in snow. Then she stood up in the dark north parlor and did the bravest and most unlawful thing of her long life. She went out across the wet stable yard and woke Silas Reed, the sexton, who had loved Bet's sister 40 years cold in that same churchyard. And she told him. Silas did not argue, and did not cross himself, and did not waste breath. He fetched his lantern. Between them, near dawn, they carried the Duchess of Ellsmere out of that sleeping house, wrapped in the very winding sheet meant to bury her, her head lolling on Bet's shoulder like a sick child's. Into the emptied coffin they packed sandbags from the boot room and a sack of last autumn's turnips to make the weight of a woman, and Silas sealed the lid down with his own hands. And when the gray morning came, he stood among the yews and buried it, straight-faced, and shoveled the earth in over sand and turnips, while the parson said the holy words above. To hide a corpse, to falsify a Christian burial. Either crime alone could have put the two of them on the gallows at Lincoln. They did it, and told not one living soul, and Silas went home and cleaned his spade. They hid her in a shepherd's hut on the black fen edge, where the mist rose off the standing water at first light, and the only sounds in all the world were the wind combing the reeds and the long grieving cry of one curlew. There Rosamund came back to life an inch at a time, and it was slow and ugly and without mercy. The opium had gone deep into her. For the better part of 3 weeks she lay racked and drenched in sweat, her body screaming for the very poison that had all but killed her, her heart lurching and knocking against her ribs, her mind scattered so wide that she wept and laughed at nothing, and could not always find her own name. Bet fed her broth off a horn spoon, a drop at a time, and held her fast through the worst of the shaking nights, and prayed the fen prayers her own mother had taught her, which were older than the church. When at last the fever of it broke, and Rosamund could hold a cup with 2 hands, Bet took the dark bottle down off the rough shelf and set it on the blanket where her lady could see it. "This is what did it, my lamb," she said quietly. "The tonic. I had it off the night table in the muddle of that morning, took it without thinking, God knows why, and hid it in my apron. I've thought 100 times since to pour it in the dike. But you should see the thing that killed you." Rosamund looked at the bottle a long while in the rushlight, the dark glass, the sweet familiar smell of it, the very stuff Lavinia had poured with her own hand each night, smoothing the coverlet, wishing her sweet dreams. She did not rage aloud. Something colder and steadier than rage settled through her, the way hard frost sets into an open field. The resolve of a woman who has been buried once already, and does not mean to lie down in the ground a second time to oblige anybody. But the poison had taken its wage, and no coming back would ever pay it back. As she mended, she found she could not walk the reed paths as she had before, without the world tilting. She tired now where once she had not. Her heart would keep, the fen doctor said gently when at last Bet dared fetch one. But she must never again ask much of it. And there was one thing more, which the doctor told her plainly because she made him. The long, slow poisoning had done a damage inside her that would not heal. She would bear no child, not ever, not now. She sat that evening by the black fen water with her knees drawn up like a girl, and she let herself grieve that single thing all the way to the bottom, alone, while the curlew cried, before she folded it away with everything else and stood up. She was alive. She was broken in her body and dead in the eyes of the whole county. Hidden in a hovel while the woman who had murdered her wore her house like a stolen gown. She had one wall of hers still standing, the deed sewn into the hem, at the back of the press, in a house another woman now ruled, and one saying of her mother's turning in her mind like a key in a lock. "They keep the last sheaf. Nothing that is truly loved is ever wholly gone. She meant now to learn whether that was true. She meant to learn whether a single soul at Aldermere had ever loved the woman they had put into the ground. Summer came green and heavy over the fens, and Rosamund learned to be a ghost that was not a ghost, to live at the very edge of her own life and watch it go on without her. Bet went up to the hall on the ordinary errands of an old servant kept about the place out of charity. And she carried the news back down to the hut like a woman carrying water in her two cupped hands, careful of every drop. And it was not the news of a house glad to be rid of its cold Duchess that she carried. It was worse than that. It was the news that broke Rosamund more surely than any cruelty could have. Her husband grieved. Not the tidy, seasonal grief of a widower, counting off the decent months until he might dance again, but a grief that frightened the servants' hall. He kept his black long past the custom. He would not have the stopped clock started nor the draped mirrors uncovered. And on the last Sunday in July, Bet, passing among the churchyard yews with a jar of flowers for her own dead, came on the Duke of Ellesmere standing at the weighted grave in the full sun with his hat in his hand, speaking low to the turned earth. She stopped where the yews hid her, and she did not mean to listen, and she heard every word. "I never told you," he said to the grave that held sand and turnips and no wife at all. "I let you go on thinking the door was shut against you. It was never shut, Rosamund. I was only a coward at the latch of it all those years, and now there's no undoing that, and I would give the whole rotten dukedom to undo it." He stood a while longer, and then he set his hat back on and walked away between the graves. And Bet waited until he was well gone before she came out from the trees, shaking. She brought the words down to the fen that evening, plain, the way Rosamund had made her promise always to bring things, no softening, no leaving out. And Rosamund turned her face to the reeds so the old woman should not see it. And she understood at last the true shape of the thing that had been wrong with her marriage all along. It was not simply that Julian had been cold to her. It was that they had both stood behind bolted doors these 3 years, each one waiting for the other to be the first to knock, each too proud and too badly hurt long ago to lift the latch first. She had not been only the victim of his coldness. She had been its partner in it, night after night, at the long white table. The understanding gave her no comfort. It made the grave he wept over a lonelier place than ever. For there was a woman living in the reeds who might have answered him, and had chosen, out of fear, to let him grieve. And while the Duke stood weeping at a false grave, his cousin rose. Bet told it flatly, the way you report a weather that will spoil the standing hay. Lavinia ran everything now. She had moved into the small parlor that had been Rosamund's. She sat at the foot of the great table in the Duchess's own chair. She had made herself soft and constant, and always there at Julian's side through the black months, the one person who never once flinched from his silences. And the county, kindly, had already begun to marry them off over its teacups. Poor, devoted Lavinia. She'll make him a comfortable, sensible wife, and keep the great fortune in the family, which after all is only right and proper. The fortune. That was the whole of it. And Rosamund, sitting by the black water, saw the design entire now, laid out as clear as the drained fen in its neat squares below the wolds, a dead Duchess, a grieving Duke, and a devoted cousin who had run the house for years and knew where every last paper in it was kept. Come then into the small parlor at Aldermere on a wet night late in August, and see the thing from the other side. For a threat is only truly frightening once you have watched the hand that makes it. And Lavinia Croft's hands were very steady that night, The rest of the house slept. She had bolted the door and drawn the curtains close, and by the light of 2 candles she was forging a deed. She did it with a card player's patience and a needlewoman's care. On the desk before her lay a fresh sheet of parchment she had aged herself, held over a candle flame till it browned at the edges, then left a fortnight in the damp of the wine cellar until it yellowed like a thing 30 years old. Beside it lay a full 12-month stolen practice. Sheet on sheet where she had copied, again and again, the dead Duchess's looping hand and the 2 trustees' signatures, until her own wrist had learned their turns by heart. Now she wrote the new settlement clean and slow. £30,000, the very same figure, but with one small omission that changed everything in the world. She left out the restraint upon anticipation. She left out Lady Vane's wall. A settlement without that single clause was a fortune with an unlocked gate, a fortune that could be moved, assigned, drawn upon by any hand that held the paper and the will to use it. She signed the dead woman's name at the foot and blew upon the ink and thought, as she often thought, that it was not theft. It was a correction. For 30 years, the world had poured everything into the laps of women who were merely born to it. The faces, the fortunes, the dukes, while women like Lavinia, quicker by half and twice as useful, arranged the flowers and slept in the second-best bedrooms and were thanked and forgotten before the candles were snuffed. Rosamund had owned a great fortune and a fine husband, and had prized neither. She had drifted through these rooms as though the whole of Aldermere faintly wearied her. Where, Lavinia asked the dark window, was the justice in that? She had simply set the justice right herself, a spoonful at a time. And if a spoonful is a small, quiet thing, well, so is a woman's whole life when nobody troubles to look at it. There remained one loose thread, and it nagged her. The original deed. She had hunted for it the length of the spring and found nothing. She had turned out the study, the strong boxes, the very floorboards under the desk. And now she rose, taking a candle, and went along the cold corridor to the room that had been the Duchess's, and opened the press and took down the dead woman's gowns one by one to search them a second time. She ran her hands over the silks in the candlelight, cuff and collar and seam. She lifted the harvest gown, the gold one sewn with wheat, and turned it, and her fingers passed along the deep hem, over the flat stiffness sewn inside it, and read that stiffness as nothing but a doubled band of braid, the way any dressmaker waits a good hem to make it hang. She hung the gown back on its peg. She had held the proof of her own ruin in her 2 hands, in the light of her own candle, and put it away as trimming. It is the particular arrogance of very clever people to be certain they have looked everywhere. The last piece was the apothecary, and that she managed the following week over a glass of the Duke's Madeira. Mr. Pike came gray and reluctant. His book, had any magistrate ever opened it, showed a great deal of laudanum sold to Aldermere that spring, and he knew it, and it had begun to keep him from his sleep. Lavinia was kind to him. She was always kind. She spoke warmly of his family and of the trustees who would soon call at Michaelmas to see the new deed proved and the fortune settled, and of how very much depended now on everyone remembering the sad, plain facts of the case the same way. And then, gently, over the second glass, she reminded him, as a friend reminds a friend, of exactly what the law does to an apothecary who pronounces a living woman dead and buries her. Mr. Pike set down his glass with a hand that was not quite steady, and said that of course he remembered the facts, and that of course they were as she said. He was hers after that. She showed him out into the rain herself, and stood a moment in the doorway watching him go, and did not know, could not have imagined, that 30 miles off across the black fen, in a shepherd's hut by a rushlight, the woman she had buried was learning of the forged deed that very night, and understanding, with a frost-cold calm, that only one paper left in England could break it. The gown came out of the house the way the truth so often does, carried by the humblest hands beneath a cloth, and never once suspected. Michaelmas was near, and the whole hall was in an uproar of readying for the harvest ball. And Bet went up among the bustle to help with the linen and the borrowed plate. When she came down again at dusk, folded small in the bottom of her basket under a square of sacking, was a gown of harvest gold silk sewn with wheat. That night in the hut, kneeling by the one rushlight, Rosamund unpicked the old stitches from the deep hem, her own stitches, set in a shaking hand the night before her death, and drew out a paper folded down to the size of her palm, yellowed along its creases, but whole. Her mother's wall. The true settlement, with Mr. Thorne's original seal upon it and the trustees' real signatures beneath, and every line of the restraint upon anticipation still black and legible and deadly to anyone who would move that money. She held it to the flame a long moment and read it through. Then she folded it back into the hem and sewed it home again with small, firm stitches. For she had understood something. There was no safer strongbox in all of England than the very gown that would prove to a roomful of witnesses that she still drew breath. She did not sleep. She sat in the low doorway, with the mist coming up cold off the black water. And she reckoned honestly the whole cost of what she meant to do, the way she had always reckoned everything. Her walking back into the light would ruin Lavinia utterly. And there was a hard, cold part of Rosamund that wanted precisely that. And she would not lie to herself and call it anything nobler. She was not a saint. But her walking back would also drag old Bet and Silas Reed out of the shadows they had risked the rope to keep. And if she was careless of it, her justice might yet see the two people who loved her most swinging at Lincoln. And there was this. Besides, her long silence had let Julian grieve at an empty grave through a whole green summer. And she had chosen that silence night after night, out of fear, and it had been a cruelty. She was not clean-handed in this business. She meant to walk in with her eyes open about that much. She thought of her mother by the fire, plaiting the last sheaf into its little straw woman, keeping the harvest's green life all through the dead of the year so that it might rise again come spring. Nothing that is truly loved is ever wholly gone. She had spent a whole summer finding out whether she herself had been loved. And she had her answer now. She had heard it spoken over a false grave in a strong man's cracked voice. The answer changed nothing about the danger. It changed everything about the returning. At dusk on Michaelmas Eve, she dressed. Bet drew the gold silk down over shoulders grown thinner than they had been, and did up the small buttons at the back with fingers that shook worse than her lady's. And the two women said very little, for there was very little left to say. Rosamund was pale and worn, and her damaged heart gave its damaged flutter when she climbed up into the hired trap. But she sat straight against the seat, and her eyes were clear and dry. The trap carried her up out of the fen and along the wold road under a great rising harvest moon, toward the far blaze of light that was Aldermere Hall, with every window burning gold and the fiddles already going. She heard the music before ever she saw the doors. She laid her gloved hand flat against the deep hem of her gown and felt the stiff truth sewn safe inside it. And she stepped down from the trap onto the gravel she had thought never to stand on again, and closed her hand upon the cold iron of the great door. "Good evening, husband. I have come home for what is mine." The words went out into a silence so complete that the guttering of the nearest candle was the loudest thing in the gallery. Julian crossed the floor toward her through the parting crowd like a man walking in sleep, and stopped an arm's length off, and searched her face for the trick that had to be in it. A mask, a cruel and clever likeness. The fever of his own long grief made flesh at last to torment him. He found instead the small white scar above her left brow that no one living but a husband knew of, and the particular way she carried her chin, and the whole of the woman he had wept down into the ground. His hand came up between them and did not quite dare to close the last inch. "Rosamund," he said, and his voice broke apart on the second syllable of it. "I buried you. I stood over your grave in the rain. I have stood over it every Sunday since." "You stood over sandbags and turnips," she answered gently, and it was more terrible for being gentle. "And over a sexton and an old woman who risked the gallows to carry me out of this house before the earth took me. I did not die of a fever, Julian. I was poisoned, emptied a little each night, for 6 weeks, by a hand under this roof, for 30,000 pounds. And she turned, at last, her whole body in the gold silk, and looked at her cousin. Lavinia had gone the gray-white of old tallow, but she was clever to the very marrow, and she rallied even from this, even now, pitching her voice warm and full of sorrow for the listening room. "The poor creature is deranged," she said, and let a tremble of pity into it. "Grief has broken some wretched impostor's wits. Or worse, the dead are permitted to walk tonight, and we are all of us damned and dreaming. Julian, dearest, only send to Louth for Mr. Pike, who laid the true Duchess out with his own hands, and he will tell you what I—" "Mr. Pike is here," Rosamund said. "I ask that he be invited." At the far pillar, gray among the barley sheaves, the apothecary stood with his hat crushed in his 2 fists and the sweat shining on his lip. And under the turned faces of the whole county, he found he had not the courage in him to swear a living woman dead a second time. He looked at the polished floor. He said nothing at all, and his nothing rang out through that gallery louder than any oath. And then Lavinia made the single misstep that clever, cornered people cannot help but make. She reached out her foot for the one flagstone she still believed was solid beneath her. "There is a settlement," she said, drawing herself up tall, her voice climbing. "Lately proved and lodged with the trustees this very quarter day. Mr. Thorne has it. He witnessed it. And it does not say one word of what this woman claims. The money is provided for. It is all in perfect order." She had said it to the room. She had named the paper, and its keeping, and the day of it, before anyone had asked her to. Old Mr. Thorne, who was indeed among the guests, drew the folded deed from his own breast pocket with a frown, for he had carried it there, meaning to speak of it to the Duke that very night. And Rosamund knelt down, there in the blaze of 1,000 candles, and with the small scissors that hung at her chatelaine, she opened the deep hem of the gown they had all believed was buried, and drew out a second paper, yellowed and whole, and rose and held it out to the old solicitor without a word. "Read them together, Mr. Thorne," was all she said. "You drew one of them yourself." The old man carried both to the branch of candles on the mantel, beside the little straw woman of the last sheaf, and bent his gray head over them, one in each hand, a long, dreadful while. The gallery did not breathe. When he straightened, his face had changed, and his dry voice carried to the farthest corner of the room. "This one is the true deed," he said, lifting Rosamund's. "My own seal, my own hand of 30 years since, and Lady Vane's restraint upon anticipation, plain in its place." He raised the other, Lavinia's, and his hand had begun to shake with an old man's anger. "And this one is a forgery." The clause struck out. "The signature's a copy, good, but a copy, and dated, madam, to a week when the Duchess it names had already, by your own account, been 6 months in her grave." He let it fall from his fingers to the boards. Every head in the gallery turned as one to Lavinia, waiting for her to deny it, and Lavinia, with the true deed in an old man's hand, and the false one at her feet, and the silent apothecary at the pillar, and her cousin standing alive in the murdered woman's gown, opened her mouth to save herself. And what fell out instead was the thing she had carried 30 years and never once said aloud. "It should have been mine," she said, low and shaking, before her own will could stop her tongue. "All of it. You never even wanted him." 100 witnesses heard it. She heard it herself, and her hand flew to her mouth. But it was said, and it could not be unsaid. And Rosamund had not been required to raise her voice above a murmur to bring it out of her. The plan had asked for a dead woman, and it had made a living one. And now, by its own design, it had spoken its own confession into a crowded room. They did not drag Lavinia Croft from the gallery in irons that night, though the magistrate standing white-faced among the guests would gladly have obliged. Her undoing was more complete than any constable could have made it. She was ruined before the whole assembled county, in her own words, by a scheme that had required a corpse and produced a witness. Forgery was a hanging matter in England then, and the slow poisoning of a wife was worse, and the proofs stood thick around her. The true deed and the false laid side by side. Mr. Pike's apothecary book, black with laudanum, sold to Aldermere that spring. The last dark bottle old Bet had kept half a year on a fen shelf. She was not hanged. Rosamund, who might have pressed for the rope, and who was honest enough with herself never to pretend she had not for one hard moment wished it, chose instead the colder mercy, the one that let her keep her own hands clean and gave Lavinia the single fate she had always most dreaded. The cousin was suffered to go abroad, quietly and at once, stripped of the name and the place and the usefulness she had traded her soul for, to end her long cleverness among strangers who would never know what she had been or what she had done. It was not a punishment the story reached down and dealt her. It was the plain harvest of every seed she had ever planted, and she went out to reap it entirely alone, which was the very thing she had schemed her whole life to escape. Bet Marsh and Silas Reed did not hang either, though by the letter of the law they might have. Julian saw to that with the whole weight of the dukedom behind him, standing before the magistrate to swear that what those two had done in the cold north parlor was the saving of his living wife, and no crime the law of England had any business touching. Bet lived out her years in the warmest cottage on the estate, and was buried at the last, when her time came, near the sister the sexton had loved. And Silas kept the churchyard until his own hands could no longer lift the spade. And to the end of their days, neither of them ever grew quite easy under the strange new custom of being thanked. And the house did not mend in a night, for Rosamund would not let it pretend to. There was no rushing embrace in the gallery, no single healing kiss to wipe out a spring and a summer of grief and silence and near murder. She had been buried alive while he was away in London. She had grieved, alone by black water, a child she would now never bear. She had learned that the coldness of their marriage had been half her own work, and he had let her think a door was bolted that was only ever left ajar, and had wept his sorry at an empty grave one whole season too late. None of that was a wound a kiss could close, and she said so. So they began again the slow way, which is the only true way, at first with nothing more than talking. In the plain daylight, in the very rooms where they had once passed each other like courteous strangers, each of them learning at last to be the one who lifts the latch first. He courted his own wife through that autumn and winter as he had never troubled to court her before the wedding, and she let him, warily, and made him earn every yard of it, because she had earned her own life back out of the ground and did not mean to hand it over cheap. By the following spring, the clocks at Aldermere were running again, and the mirrors were uncovered, and the black was folded away into the cedar chests for good. They would have no child of their own. They faced that squarely, together, and did not paper over the grief of it. And in the years that came, they filled the great cold house instead with the children of the estate. Tenants' sons taught their letters in the long gallery, an orphaned niece raised as their own, and with a warmth those rooms had not held in 3 hard generations. And on the mantelpiece, where a clock had once stood, stopped at the hour of her death, Rosamund set the little corn dolly from the harvest ball. The woman plaited out of the last cut sheaf, kept through all the dark of the year, so the green life should rise again come spring. Julian asked her once, watching her set it straight, why she would keep a twist of old straw in the place a clock belonged. She looked at it, and then at him, and told him the thing her mother used to say by the fire, over the little straw woman, in the last light of every harvest. They cut the wheat, she said, but they keep the last sheaf, and nothing that is truly loved is ever wholly gone.